This next verse, verse 24, it's about our relationship with the world from the perspective of how we believe the world to be. And this is going to involve thinking about things, thinking about how we believe the world to be. And I'm going to explore this in a fairly conventional sense, but at the end I'm going to cut through it with a completely different perspective. So the first thing we're looking at is this idea, this belief that the world is made up of things. In the previous verse, we're told that the world consists of thought constructs which we give a name to. Here's an example that was used by Alan Watts, a guru and writer from the 1960s. Here's a fist. It can do a bit of damage in a particular context. Where's the fist gone? Did the fist come into existence and now it's gone out of existence? If it's a thing, if the fist is a thing, how can it do that? As soon as I open my hand, it's got quite a different effect, hasn't it? Hasn't got the power of the fist. So fist is a noun, it's an object. Here it's come into existence, and I open my hand and it's gone out of existence. So is it correct to say that the fist is an object? Is it not simply a process? So we have this habit of giving objecthood, objectivity to processes. Here's the example I used previously of a mouse. We think of a mouse as an object, but it's actually a function. It's actually really defined in terms of what we do with it. If this isn't attached to a computer and you've no idea what a computer is, you really have no use for it. Maybe you'll use it as an ornament or something, I don't know. You'll find some other completely unintended use for it. But it's also a process. It's a process of various plastics and metals being put together in a particular form. And at some point it will all disintegrate, hopefully, and disappear to its constituent atoms. So in a way it's like a whirlpool in water. A whirlpool in water has got a definite force, hasn't it? It's like the fist. But what is it? It's nothing more than water. A whirlpool in water is nothing more than water. You could argue that there are invisible forces at work, but that's simply another way of talking about it. That's even more abstract than the actual whirlpool itself. So everything is process, it's patterns, and it takes a mind to identify patterns and to put a name onto them. So that's what verse 23 was about. Following on, verse 24, not ever being in existence, what things are there that are born? In causation, nothing is lost. When effect producing objects, and these are samskrita, which we covered in verse 19, are regarded as like unto a barren woman's child or a flower in the sky, one perceives that grasping and grasped are in error and desists. And in brackets, Professor Suzuki wrote, desists from committing the same error. But I think really what we do is we desist from grasping. So, this is the first part of verse 24. Let's look at it in detail. Not ever being in existence, what things are there that are born? So we're getting over our tendency to objectify things, to make objects out of processes. It's one big process that is going on. One thing gets transformed into another. And you might argue, well, what is it that's being transformed? What's the underlying stuff? Well, there isn't any. It's a bit like when spring gets transformed into summer, which gets transformed into autumn, into winter, into spring again. What's being transformed? What does it actually make sense to say that spring becomes summer? There's something called a spring which somehow changes into something called a summer. They're quite different things. We're describing a process, but we make them into nouns, and these particular ones are so important they sometimes get capital letters, but they don't become one another. In fact, there is no spring in as much as we want to define something as spring. There's no such thing as summer. It's we who define a particular pattern as summer, or as the seasons. What things are there that are born? So this process has been going on since the beginning of the universe. And even the beginning of the universe is an arbitrary notion. The beginning of the universe must have come from somewhere. And on it goes. Nothing is lost. Well, this is the principle of conservation, isn't it? Everything is always complete in itself. Everything is always as it has been. There are apparent transformations going on. There are patterns that we detect. These are the thought constructions, and we put a label on it. We name these patterns, and then they become objects. When effect producing objects are regarded, so these are the samskrita. These are what we understand as creating conditions for things to change. They depend on other conditions, and they themselves supply the conditions for future transformations. But the thing is, there's only ever effects. The idea of a fundamental cause to everything is only a conjecture, a hypothesis, which the Indian mind, thankfully, does not seem to be particularly disposed to. So we can forget the whole notion that there's some primordial cause. There's only effects. But it's saying here that these effects have no substance. They cannot produce causes. They cannot be causes, and therefore they should be regarded as like unto a barren woman's child, or a flower in the sky. The whole point of this is to understand everything that is happening as a process, so that we can remove our emotional investment in it, just as we do when we wake up from a dream. We label all the experiences of the night as a dream, and then we can immediately forget about it, which is what happens. This is awakening. So the idea of causes, a cause being something which produces an effect, should be regarded as a notion which is inherently contradictory, like a barren woman's child or a flower in the sky. Because when we believe in the reality of the objects, that gives us something to hang on to. We somehow believe that that object is tangible and can give us satisfaction. So we grasp for it. The mind is drawn to this object like iron is to a magnet, but it's ultimately unrewarding, unsatisfactory, because it has no inherent substance. There is nothing which is going to plug that hole. So the point here is examining our grasping. What is it that we long for, that we believe will give us ultimate satisfaction? Of course, there are things we can work towards. There are things we might like to have. Some nice things. We might like to have a nice house and all that. And that might be one of the parameters by which we style our life. And that's okay in its own context. But we're looking a little bit deeper than that. So to conclude this, there is nothing that is to be born, nor is there anything that has been born. Even causation is not. It is because of worldly usage that things are talked of as existing. I think there's a bit of a typo here, typographical error. It says worldly. I think it's supposed to be worldly. But actually, in the light of the next part of this, worldly seems quite appropriate. So our reality is very much constructed by the words that we use, by the language that we use, and I'll cover that in the next video. But before then, I want to take a completely different approach to what's just been said. One of the greatest assets we have for the study of consciousness, for gaining some understanding and insight into the nature of consciousness, is the phenomenon of dreams. In one phase of my life I spent a lot of time looking into dreams. And there was a particular story I came across, I can't remember it very well. It's from quite a while back. Somebody gave an account of a particular dream about being guillotined, having their head cut off, and there was a whole process by which they went to trial and were found guilty and then marched to the gallows and then the guillotine coming down. It was quite an involved dream which this person communicated. And at the point that the guillotine came down, this was the point at which the dreamer woke up. And he woke up, something had fallen over his head. Maybe it was a bedside lamp that a cat had knocked over or something. I can't remember the particular cause for awakening. But it seemed that this thing that had fallen across his neck, which had woken him up, happened at exactly the same point as the guillotine coming down. And it seemed to this person that the whole dream had been constructed at that moment. What had seemed like a long dream had been constructed at that very moment. Now it's possible it was just a coincidence, isn't it? But I find the explanation given holds true in my own experience. I can't think of any particular examples that I had of something like that. But it seems to me that a dream constructs its own history instantaneously. Well, I suppose one of the examples I could give is that when you meet a friend in a dream, and it's not a friend that you have in your waking state, but you've got a whole history with that friend that suddenly comes into existence. I can remember being with that friend the day before at a particular location, and perhaps I'm arranging to meet that friend at that location again. So that whole history comes into being instantaneously. The whole sequence of events which leads up to that moment has been constructed at that exact moment. I'm reminded too of the composer Mozart's description of his talent. He heard a piece of music in its entirety all at once, and when he wrote it down he was just unravelling that. So when he had the inspiration for a piece of music, it wasn't something that came in bits. It was something which came complete in one particular moment, and then he had to unwrap it into time, into a sequence of time, a sequence of notes in time. So this is a bit more immediate and dramatic. This is how we can understand that there is no causation. This is the significance of there being no causation. This is what's pointing us to realization of the true nature. This transcendence of causation is what is pointing us to the true nature of consciousness.